Hello, I'm Annie. I'm sitting on my floor for height purposes. So I wanted to talk about feminist anthropology because I think that's super interesting, and I also think it's like really important that we all kind of understand that. So I guess I'll just kind of kick it off now. um, so basically, like women are clearly always a part of every society, and they're very important, and they play life would literally not exist without women. So I think that it's important to focus on that, but I think that it's very easy not to, because I think so much of our culture is kind of treated as such as a way that we shouldn't focus on it. And I think that we learn about really important people like Franz Boas and like Clifford Geertz and everybody like that, but they're just as important as a lot of the women in their same field and everything, like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who are both like Franz Boas' students, so he even had to have seen that they were important in themselves. So something I think is like really important is thinking of like women in the past and how they have affected anthropology today, and specifically in the world of feminism and things like that. I think because men had dominated not just the world of anthropology, but the world in general for almost the entirety of time, I think that it's easy to kind of forget, but the first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of Margaret Mead and how she kind of made that thing, kind of how she kind of made women more relevant in her society and in our society today. So as I said, she was a student of Franz Boas, and her work kind of elaborated on a lot of ideas that he kind of originally established. He was So her main book was The Coming of Age in Samoa, which was when she went to a South Sea island culture and kind of studied the adolescence of the people there. We all read some of her work that she did on that. This was kind of a big deal that she even chose these people, because originally people didn't. It was uncommon, I guess, to fully study cultures that were completely different than what she was normal and what you live in. So that was kind of like a very big deal. And so she focused on the adolescence and how a lot of children were in this culture seemingly like left alone to kind of just like come back into their own sexualities and their own roles of adulthood and what that means. And she kind of wanted to see how the adolescent study that she did in these group of girls, how that went and changed into the society that she grew up in, and the society that was more relevant to the people who were looking at her work. She can be criticized that she only studied 50 girls, and was 9 months enough time, especially if 6 months of that was more research-based of, like, learning the language, and, like, so only 3 months was actually spent studying these girls. So I think it's hard to tell. But I think regardless, Margaret Mead had a lot of an impact in what the world in general thought about women and how we view women in a scientific standpoint, because she opened the doors for a lot of other women today and stuff to look at her ideas and how you handle anthropology just as a whole, but also for what it looks like to be a woman in anthropology, because she was so wildly successful, and to this day she is still one of the most successful anthropologists of all time, and I think that that's very important to note. The next thing I wanted to talk about was Ruth Benedict. She was also a student of Franz Boas, and she was kind of in the same circle as Margaret Mead, and they had a lot of the same like connections and studies and things like that. Ruth Benedict, on the other hand, though, she kind of wanted to do more culture as a whole rather than like a lot of her book Patterns of Culture kind of had more to do with that, because she focused more on culture as a whole and how the ways that interacts and how all cultures are kind of the same even though they're all different, rather than, which is kind of a lot of what Margaret Mead was saying in similar ways of her, like the adolescence of this small group can still be compared to the adolescence of the culture that we're more used to, and so there is like similarities between everything, and I think that was like a main part of what Benedict was trying to get at it. She said that a culture, like an individual, is more or less a consistent pattern of thought and action. So that's kind of like a very broad definition of culture and what culture means, because it was very like all culture is kind of, we're all connected and we're all different. Like at our core, human beings are all the same. It's just how you express that core that's different and how that changes. it was very important to her because she wanted to look at culture in a lens that's outside of normal bias, because I think that we all bring our own culture into other people's experiences and other people's thought processes in their own kind of society. So I think she was very what is the core and the meaning and the values of that culture and the cultural systems, rather than like, oh, they do this weird thing and that is weird because it's not our culture, and like kind of setting aside your personal opinion and more like, how does this culture actually physically function, which I think is good. So that kind of those two people, they kind of like led to the bigger sense of like what is feminist anthropology as a whole, because I think that that was kind of more like the first wave kind of stuff, or not like legitimately, but like they were kind of the first group of people to kind of be like, oh, women are in this, and like they kind of have stuff to say. And then cut to the 70s, so 1970s, there was more like second wave of feminism was happening, and it was completely different than what was going on in the 20s, because it was more of social equality rather than legal equality. And so a lot of people started to notice that in anthropology, things such as like man being the kind of all-encompassing term for everybody, but it's not, in the sense of the no separation between men and women, and like a way that I think is very important, because you have to recognize that they're different, but because they were kind of, women were just absorbed into men rather than two equal entities. So I think people started to notice that. So then feminist anthropology became kind of more of a way to kind of fix those problems of the logistics that kind of how anthropology favored men for a really long time, and even just subconsciously. And so like it was even defined a couple times as being like focused on correcting male bias within the discipline. So similar to what Ruth Benedict was thinking, it's a lot of that personal bias that you go into it, and this bias happened to be kind of towards men as a whole rather than women, which, not that it should be to women, but it was kind of a focus. It was always assumed that if something was going to happen, it would be of the men, and that women were kind of more reduced to like the housewives and the mothers and the caregivers and like the more kinship type roles, rather than teachers, rather than scientists, and so on and so on and so on, which is like equally important. And I think that when you only look at one half of the culture, so the men's side of the culture, you're completely ignoring a equally crucial, significant portion of that culture. So that kind of, moves forward and stuff, and then you get more of like what is kind of today, and how every feminism issue that kind of exists in today's culture is a result of thousands and thousands of years of that disconnect between men and women that have always existed. So it's very important, I think, that we all kind of recognize that. And I think that's a lot of what feminism in anthropology is today, is kind of recognizing that like it's a long trails, like the butterfly effect of going down and down and down and down until you realize that it's all this like blatant like this like discipline of just ignoring women in a certain standpoint, and trying to kind of reconcile that kind of inconsistency that has existed within that men and women in anthropology in general. And I think that that changed from like women as a gatherer, which is actually an essay done by Sally Slocum, which kind of, she was one of the first people in 1975 to kind of write an essay that had criticism based on how basically a criticism of the bias that exists within anthropology towards men. And she was, again, one of the first people who kind of like set that off, and more women were kind of like, huh, that stinks, and then more men were kind of like, that's interesting, that is true, and like we've been ignoring this huge bias that's happened for thousands and thousands of years that can completely change the outcome of a lot of our cultures, and how we think, and how we just act in general in our society. And I think that it's this implicit idea of sexism that happens, and I think that anthropology, especially in the 70s, is a good example of like the implicitness of it is almost worse than when it's like outright like you're the worst, or like outright sexism, because implicit kind of implies more that it's a like fundamental value of a society rather than just like a cultural phenomenon. I mean, they're both very connected, but when you're trying to change something that's like very deep inside what someone believes and what they think, then remedying that, it kind of changes. So go back to the the man kind of problem, man being this all-encompassing word, like that wouldn't seem like a big deal, but it's the hundreds of little things like saying man instead of people, and so on and so on, that kind of like adds up to this one huge thing. So it's a bunch of implicit things that imply a greater issue of this, of women being lesser than men, even though it's more subconscious than it is like blatantly being discriminative. So it's very interesting, I think, to go through. And I think that Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict were a lot of the reason why women, I think, were taken seriously in anthropology in the 70s, and how that door was kind of opened, because like I was saying, it all comes from one area, and it's from thousands and thousands of years of build up, rather than just like, oh, this thing happened. It's a long path. And I think that women like that, and women in the 70s too, are why we can kind of learn about that, we can talk about that, and why today that's still an important thing. And you can see it everywhere in anthropology, which I think is very important, and also very cool that it's all kind of come together like that. So yes, thank you for listening. Bye.